Just on my way back from a funeral for an old, longtime friend. Really haven't seen him for years, but he was a significant person in my life, in my ministry. And we live about 3.5 hours away from that location now, so I thought I'd run down there. Just over 35 years ago, in January of 1990, my wife and I began pastoring in a little town called Valley View, Alberta. Art was on the advisory committee, which was a precursor to an elders board of the church. The advisory committee for the church, and he was one of the key leaders, and got to know him quite well over the 6.5 years that we were there. Before I share an incident, a very pivotal point in my life that Art was involved in a good way, just a couple observations. One observation was that I discovered after being in that community for a while that the church's reputation was helped by the fact that Art was there, that he would go to that church. When people found out Art was in that church, their opinion of the church would go up. It very, very unusual. I'd never seen that since in such a way. I'd say the opposite in a lot of places where people find out so-and-so goes to your church. It's like, oh my goodness, really? That person goes to your church? I want nothing to do with it. It was the exact opposite with Art. He was so well respected. His dad homesteaded effectively where the town was back in 1918, and Art grew up there and just had a stellar reputation. But something happened very early in my ministry there. It was early in that ministry, but early in my pastoral ministry, being my first pastorate. I think it was within the first few months of my time there. And I was visiting different people in the church, and I visited this one couple in the church. And as I was talking with them and just discussing life and trying to understand where they're at spiritually, I kind of had this sense that maybe they weren't believers yet. And so I asked them what we know as the diagnostic questions. Do you know for certain if you die tonight, you go to heaven? I can't remember what their answer was. But it really sets up the second question, which is, if you were to die tonight and stand before God, and God were to ask you, why should I let you in? What would you say? And their answer was a very common answer for non-church people, and actually a very common answer I found for church people, but not a biblical answer, because their answer was, I'm a pretty good person. Haven't done anything really bad. I do these good things, and I haven't, killed anyone or whatever. Pretty good person, which biblically doesn't cut it. Scripture makes it pretty clear. It's by grace we're saved through faith, not of ourselves. That all our righteous acts are like filthy rags. The best we can do is garbage. And so I shared the gospel with them. I told the story, which I'm sure they'd heard before, about Jesus dying in our place and rising from the grave, and that we could respond by repenting and believing him. And they just kind of listened and nodded, and that was that, and no real response. Well, it turns out as soon as I left, they phoned someone else in the church, quite upset with the fact that I would presume to talk to them like that. And this other individual gave me a call and reamed me out and told me that I should assume that everyone in the church was a Christian, but not to do anything like that again. Well, I'd grown up in the church, and I was not about to assume that people in the church were Christians. And I'd become a pastor in part to share the gospel. That's why I was doing it. And for me, that would be a deal breaker. And so I did the only thing I knew to do as a young pastor. I called an emergency board meeting. And this person attended, the person who these people had called, who called me and got after me. And the members of the advisory committee got together, and Art was a part of that. And as we gathered, for this meeting. They're all wondering, why are we here? Because it wasn't a scheduled meeting. I just called it that day. I said, okay, here's the situation. Here's who I visited, and here's what I did, and here's what happened. And this individual here says that I should assume that everyone in the church is a Christian. And I didn't know Art really well yet at that point. But the more I got to know him, the more I realized how unusual his response was, because Art erupted. And Art's not an erupter kind of guy. He's very steady, very calm, very gracious and gentle. He erupted. And he said, you don't assume anyone's a Christian. And if you feel like you need to share the gospel, you share the gospel. And the other members of the leadership team who were there, in addition to this other person, were completely on side with that. And that was the end of the discussion. That was a significant moment in my ministry, not just in that church, but a significant moment in my ministry as a pastor. To have someone of such a stellar reputation, someone of such influence, someone who's pretty calm and reserved, to speak so strongly to that issue and to tell me, in no uncertain terms, that if I thought someone needed to hear the gospel, I should share the gospel. And that stuck with me, not just for that ministry, but on to other churches and outside the church and through my life. And as I was at his funeral and heard and remembered many stories of his life, that was how he operated. He picked up hitchhikers and shared the gospel. He visited people in coffee shops and shared the gospel. He made friends everywhere and shared the gospel. So for me, you go to a funeral to support the family and be a part of that larger community of comfort. But I found myself today being just reinvigorated and remotivated for the gospel. And the take home for me, even though I came to this funeral, made this trip, it's 3.5 hours each way, made this trip with that thought in my mind about Art telling me, if you think someone needs to hear the gospel, share the gospel. To hear his stories again and realize that that's who he was and that's how he lived, and just the level of consistency, authenticity that line carries in his life. It's just lit or relit a fire under my spiritual backside. And a reminder to me and to, I guess, to you, anyone who's listening to this, not to make assumptions about people spiritually, for good or for ill. And then if you think someone needs to hear the gospel, you better share the gospel. It's a no-lose situation. They either don't need to hear it, in which case you get to practice sharing the gospel, or they do need to hear it, in which case you might change someone's eternal destiny. So it's been a good day. A funeral, but a good day of having my faith and my evangelistic fervor rejuvenated. Just a reminder, it's like a stake in the ground in my life. Art speaking up at that meeting. Don't assume anyone's a Christian. And if you think someone needs to hear the gospel, share the gospel.